Wayne is is a founder of Energy ARO, which was created to serve the growing worldwide oil and gas abandonment need. A former CEO and COO of a public E&P company, Wayne is immediately familiar with the A&P and abandonment issues from both a financial and operational perspective. Throughout his career, Wayne has been responsible for decommissioning hundreds of wells individually and in programs onshore, offshore, US, Australia, and Venezuela, ranging from shallow, simple land A&P to complex, costly well abandonments, and sensitive environmental reclamation. Wayne has a BS in petroleum engineering from Texas A&M University and an MBA from SMU. Wayne volunteers with the Prison Entrepreneurship Program and walks his rescue dog, Chimney, almost every day. And with that, over to you, Wayne.
Okay, so let me get the screen sharing up real fast.
Awesome.
All right, I hope everyone can see that.
Excellent. Thank you, Wayne.
Okay, so before we get started, I met Carlos, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. We were talking about a completion technology. And so Carlos, good to kind of reconnect. And I don't want to miss anyone here, but I did see a few folks join in that I know from the past. So Jeffrey, great to see you and kind of reconnect. Edgar, we get to chat, but I saw that you're on, so good to see that, and of course Paul. So good to see you guys here. I'm going to talk just a minute before we get started. I think on the bio it's kind of maybe worthwhile to talk about. So I'm employed for 5 more days. Still the CEO of a Canadian company. That ends here in a little bit, but I kind of wanted to talk about, so how did Energy ARO get started? Because, like I said, I think it's, I do think it's kind of interesting for this group in particular. So about 7 or 8 months ago, I had a call from a gentleman that used to work for me, just a few years younger than myself. And we had lunch. So he was having a hard time finding a job, and he just said, hey, do you have any ideas, Wayne, on some things that I might be able to do? And my advice was, well, and he also mentioned, hey, being over 55, oil prices low, it's really, really hard out there. And so my advice was, hey, Alan, think about what you do really, really well. You're a great interventions engineer. You've done that for a long, long time. And, any other skills that you can think of that you're passionate about. And so you might think about starting your own business. A lot of things for those of us who are a little bit older, shall I say. So, that's something that you should really think about. So anyway, that evening at home, I was thinking about our conversation, and I knew that I was going to be in transition soon. And so I thought, well, why don't I take my own advice? What is it that I seem to know a lot about, and that I have passion about? And that's kind of where Energy ARO got started. With really kind of experience as an operations engineer from the ground up, but also as an executive in a company dealing with ARO, abandonment liabilities on the balance sheet, and how that kind of all worked out. So that's kind of the genesis of Energy ARO. And I guess I would kind of give that same advice to any of the folks that are on this call. Hey, if there's something that you kind of have a specialty in that you know a lot about, or that you're really passionate about, think about maybe starting your own business doing it. It's kind of the way things are right now. So let's get on with the presentation. This is called "Don't Leave with a Bad Goodbye," and I'll kind of give a summary. The U.S. abandonment retirement obligation or decommissioning liability is in the hundreds of billions of dollars right now. Texas onshore alone has approximately 100,000 inactive wells. The abandonment liability on those is about $6 billion, and another 400,000 active wells in the state, all onshore, with a current abandonment liability of about $25 billion. So we'll talk about the relevant topics of the day around decommissioning, the process oil companies use to determine their abandonment retirement obligation, or ARO, and how that impacts asset value, and talk about how, as an industry, we leave without a bad goodbye, and in the words of Clint Black. So here we go. I will say up front that, you know, anytime giving a presentation, there's always a broad spectrum of expertise. So my guess is there will be some people that know very little about abandonments, oil and gas abandonments, and then there are going to be some that know more than I know about it for sure. So, like I say, this is kind of meant to try and hit the you know, kind of the middle of the road, but certainly any questions as they are, whether they're general, they're no dumb questions. I know I had to call my CFO the other day, and I said, "Hey, I've got a really dumb question. I should probably know this." And she said, "Well, there are no dumb questions," and that I'll say the same thing here. There are no dumb questions. And then if you have some things that you can add that, you know, go well above and beyond, then that's fantastic too. We'll be able to get all of those. But what you should expect today in the presentation, first of all, hopefully everyone will learn something new about oil and gas P&As. It is even though it seems like a pretty narrow subject, it's surprisingly broad. Understand hot button issues around oil and gas inactive wells right now, get a better understanding of abandonment liabilities, and how those liabilities affect asset value. And then, as I said, you know, you think about this, maybe this is something that sparks interest, and you say, "Hey, you know what? I'm really interested. I've decided I'm really interested in this space." So, if so, is there an overlap with your skills or your interest or your experience, your passion? And you know, hey, this might spark an idea for a new technology or a new company that someone listening today starts, which would be fantastic.
Wayne, do you mind speaking a little louder? Some of them are not hearing you well, if you don't mind.
Okay, good. Is this any better?
Yeah, just speak a little louder.
Okay, good. I'll get the microphone a little bit closer. So, good discussion today, networking, and hopefully a little bit of fun. So here we go. We're going to get started on the kind of the meat of this: abandonments by any other name. So kind of a good little piece of clip art there that I found. But you know, what are these things that we call oil and gas abandonment? Well, you know, sometimes you hear it referred to as oil and gas well plugging and abandon, or P&A, and that's the most common. It's really, and we're going to have the next slide. We're going to have a little bit of an overview of the P&A process, but basically you get everything out of the well that you can. You pump cement plugs to make sure that everything is isolated, and then you eventually cut the casing near the surface and cap the well. So that's what a good P&A looks like, and we'll kind of go into what maybe a bad P&A looks like a little bit more as well. Sometimes you just hear people talk about surface abandonment, and they're usually talking about you know, kind of removing everything on the surface, whether it's a pump jack or whether it's tank battery or separators or you know, kind of anything on the surface. So, and all of these things are all very, very related. Some of them are used interchangeably when folks talk about P&As. Site remediation and reclamation, and we'll also say that this is focused on onshore P&As. So, you know, we could spend another 2 or 3 hours or more on offshore P&As. This is going to really focus on the onshore right now. So, site remediation and reclamation, really that's just kind of restoring the location back to its natural state. You know, whether it's planting native grass or planting native shrubs or trees or bringing in soil. It can kind of be anything from cleaning up the dirt so that the farmer can plow it up to really complicated remediations where you're contouring the land back and getting it back to native habitat and so on. So site remediation and reclamation, once again, it can kind of be its own silo and can be complex or very simple. Asset retirement obligation, really more of a financial term, and you'll see it in, not just in the oil and gas industry, it's for most industries that have capital items that are going to need to be retired at some time. So you'll hear that asset retirement obligation. I'll probably use the abbreviation ARO whenever I talk about that. Decommissioning or decom, once again, it's kind of the same as the P&A. It's used a little more frequently probably for offshore projects, but once again, decommissioning kind of sometimes is interchangeable a little bit with P&A. Although it does go to facilities, and it's a little bit broader term, I think, but I'll also use that term. So, cut and cap is kind of the final piece of a well P&A, like I said, where you kind of cut the casing just below the surface, put a cap on it, and then temporarily abandoned is where you take a well and you have typically cement plugs in it. Sometimes it can be bridge plugs, but some kind of plugs to make sure that oil and gas can't get to the surface. So you haven't officially plugged and abandoned the well yet, but you've temporarily abandoned it, and you're in a place where you can generally come back and pretty easily as well. So a few, kind of different terminology items. The next thing I have is a little video, and I found this on the Alberta Energy Regulatory website. I think it's kind of a good primer to get us started on oil and gas abandonment. So bear with me, it's a relatively short video, but if you'll really kind of pay attention, there's a lot of meat in it. So here we go.
There are thousands of wells located throughout Alberta. You'll find them in farmers' fields, forested lands, and cities and towns.
After a number of years, and sometimes even decades, oil and gas wells become inactive because the majority of recoverable resources has been depleted. Over the last 20 years, the number of inactive wells in the province has more than doubled to over 85,000.
Until an inactive well has been properly abandoned and the reclamation has occurred, the land cannot be used for alternative purposes. A farmer cannot grow crops on that land. A city can't develop into that particular area. An active well needs to be suspended after 12 months. Suspending a well can include installing barriers, such as cement plugs inside the well to ensure no fluid may come to surface. Licensees are required to remove handles from valves and chain up the wellhead to make sure that no one can turn the well back on. They are also required to inspect the well based on a scheduled frequency of inspections based on the well type. After a well is suspended, the licensee may choose to put the well back on production by removing the downhole plugs and reinstalling the wellhead.
A few years back, the AR realized that we had a number of inactive wells that were not meeting our suspension requirements. So the AR designed and implemented the Inactive Well Compliance Program, which was designed to bring all of the non-compliant inactive wells into compliance over a 5-year term. Under the Inactive Well Compliance Program, companies have until April 1st, 2020 to bring all of their non-compliant inactive wells into compliance. Currently, 83% of all inactive wells are now compliant with suspension requirements.
There are 3 options to bring an inactive well into compliance. You can put the well back on production, suspend the well, abandon the well, which is plugging it down whole and taking the well out of surface safely.
wells can remain suspended until a company decides that it's no longer needed for injection or production, and it can be permanently plugged and abandoned. Abandoning wells has its own set of requirements that companies must meet, and it's the step prior to remediating and reclaiming the well site.
All right. Well, good. Hopefully that was a good little kind of primer on P&As. And like I said, we've got a lot of different experience levels on the call. So hopefully everyone learned a little something about that. One thing I will tell you is that the gentleman mentioned 100% compliance by April 1st, 2020. And I can tell you that that has not happened yet. So they're still working on that. And a few of these slides and headlines will kind of illustrate some of the reasons why, I think, here in just a few minutes.
Wayne, there's a box on the right top. Not sure what that is. It's showing, it's blocking your slide, or partially blocking your slide.
Okay. How is that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. Figure out how to get it off, I will, but it looks like it's kind of minimized, at least for now. All right. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about some kind of media sound bites, some things that have been in the news lately. And we're going to kind of, from here on out, we're going to really talk about three buckets of wells. Active wells, and active wells are, just kind of what they say. They're oil and gas wells that are producing. Inactive wells are kind of just the opposite. They're oil and gas wells that are not producing. Every state, every regulatory body has a little bit different description or rules for what an inactive well is. It could be a well that hasn't produced anything in 12 months, as you heard in the video clip a minute ago. It could be a well that only produced a certain amount of oil or gas in a 3-month time period. So all of the kind of definitions of inactive wells are a little bit different depending on which jurisdiction you're in. But essentially, for most, it's kind of a well that hasn't produced anything. They then become considered inactive, and the clock starts ticking for when you need to P&A that well. So, like I say, we're going to talk mainly from here on out about inactive wells and some of our orphan wells. Orphan wells are going to get they're going to kind of get their share of airtime here. But an orphan well is kind of a well that nobody really owns anymore, and it falls upon the state or the regulatory body to do something with that well. And we'll talk about a little bit about how wells become orphan. This is the thing that governments and regulators don't like. They really, really try to keep the orphan well count down to a minimum, because at some point it's going to cost the state money. So we'll talk about that bucket as well. But here are a few kind of interesting factoids, I guess, that have come out of the media. There's an estimated over 3.2 million abandoned wells in the U.S., with another 400,000 in Canada. Some kind of recent studies have said that over 2 million of those wells were potentially not properly plugged and abandoned. There's a worldwide estimate of about 29 million abandoned wells. Global offshore abandonment spend through 2027 is estimated to be $82 billion. So even though I said, hey, we're not going to talk about offshore, the liability for offshore projects globally is staggering. And I would say that this is probably way, way underestimated. But remember, this is just over the next 7 years. This isn't for the lifetime of wells or anything else. So it's a staggering amount of money. If you've got some great technology or some great ideas, hey, the global offshore abandonment space, it would be a great space to be in. The EPA in the U.S. estimated last year, or actually 2 years ago, that abandoned wells emitted 281 kilotons of methane. Now, I got to tell you, I have no idea what 281 kilotons of methane is, but I'm pretty sure it's a lot of methane. Of course, I'm not sure that that's actually a real number either, but it's certainly a big number, and should be cause for concern. The true cost of cleaning wells is a pretty good secret in the industry, and we'll talk kind of about the costs and why that is. But if you want to go to a company's website and figure out what their real abandonment liability is, how much they think they're going to spend on abandonments over time, and then try to figure out, well, is that an accurate number or not? Good luck with that is all I can tell you, because it is near impossible. I would say quite frankly, it is impossible to really get a good handle on that externally. And part of the reason it is externally is because internally, I would say a lot of companies don't understand the liabilities. We talked about Texas onshore has about 100,000 inactive wells with an abandonment liability of $6 billion right now. About 400,000 active wells, and that adds up, like I said, to a current liability of about $25 billion. So while the offshore space is kind of a really, really big gorilla, there's plenty to do onshore as well. So here, this is from a Reuters article, special report on June 16th of 2020. And this speaks to the number of abandoned wells in the U.S. and the methane emissions from those abandoned wells. You see the number about 3.2 million on the very far left bar graph. And then just to the right, you see the methane emissions from abandoned wells, which is about 8 million metric tons. So once again, a big number, according to the U.S. EPA. Now, we can go into whether that's how accurate that is or such, but it's a big number regardless. From this article on June 16th, a few quotes: millions of abandoned wells are leaking methane, a climate menace. School district in California. This was an interesting kind of anecdotal story. There were 19 wells that a school district had on their property that needed to be abandoned. The operator filed bankruptcy. They had no assets, so everything kind of ended up going to the state. And I'll talk about how that happens here in a little bit, because it's not necessarily easy to keep your head around. But $22 million is what they plan on spending to clean these wells, of course they've already started on that. So quite a large amount of money for an operator that ended up bankrupt with no assets. Usually when an operator files bankruptcy, all of the assets go with a new owner or with a reorganized company. But there are some cases, and we'll talk about one here in just a minute, where that is not the case, and that these wells become orphaned and they become the responsibility, let's say, of the state or the local jurisdiction. In Pennsylvania, there's a backlog of over 200,000 wells to P&A. Now, that's a number that I have trouble getting my head around, and I haven't been able to go to Snopes or anything and fact check this number, because it's almost impossible to fact check. But I did go to the Pennsylvania website, and they claim to have 200,000 wells to P&A. At the current spend rate, it would take them 1,000 wells, 1,000 years to work through that backlog. And finally, the U.S. Accounting Office estimates cleaning up P&A and abandoned wells to be somewhere between $60 billion and $345 billion in the U.S. So here's another article, U.S. News and World Reports from a few months ago, and this talks specifically about Pennsylvania. And it's somewhat interesting. This is how wells become orphan wells. A Kane-backed company called ARG Resources shut down their operations in the Allegheny National Forest, and they basically didn't have any assets. All they had were liabilities. So they have 1,600 wells, buildings, tanks, roads, such that need to be P&A'd now by someone. And the state's trying to figure out how to find someone to do it other than them. And then this was an interesting quote next. I found it somewhat humorous. Hopefully you will see the humor in it as well. But the quote was, there was just one guy left and he wasn't working anymore. So evidently the company shut down and they left one guy in charge, and presumably they weren't paying him and he wasn't working there anyway. So this is a really bad story and gives the oil and gas industry a really black eye when things like this happen. But the quote further from the story is, although the ARG Resources operation is unusual, the Pennsylvania DEP sees it as a harbinger of a troubling trend and what they call a looming crisis. So, and I would say if oil and gas prices stay down this low for a prolonged period of time, then there probably is a looming crisis in this space. So we talked about 200,000 orphan wells already found in P&A, abandoned by owners over a century of drilling. And what's interesting is the state of Pennsylvania right now doesn't even know where all the wells are. They continually keep finding. You think about Pennsylvania as really the earliest state with oil and gas well drilling and producing. They've got a bunch of wells. They don't even know where they are. I mean, somebody will be out with a dozer and they might find a piece of casing sticking up. It's an old well that no one knew was there. And it may or may not have been plugged. But if it was plugged, it probably wasn't plugged correctly. Someone probably put some old timbers or something down it and called it good. And, 70 years ago, that was kind of thought to be okay. Not so much anymore. Here's this is an article that is particularly near and dear to my heart because I remember where I was when I heard about this. I was actually in our boardroom in Calgary, and there was a company called Trident that had a lot of shallow gas wells. The gas prices in Canada are a lot worse than they are here in the U.S., so they were financially in big trouble. And what happened is their entire board of directors resigned one day. They had some obligations with the regulatory agency in Alberta, and they couldn't financially meet those obligations. And rather than going into bankruptcy or anything, they basically laid off all the employees and the board of directors all resigned, and they just said, find us. Most of the directors were actually in the U.S. at the time anyway. But the company ended up with 4,700 wells that the Alberta Energy Regulator had to take over. Those are kind of orphan wells now that we're talking about. There's nobody that owns them. They're kind of the ward of the state, if you will. That added to 3,000 orphan wells that were already awaiting remediation in the province. So Alberta has a bit of a problem with that. And finally, this kind of makes a lot of sense. This is the way I think things work in the U.S., but there was a case in Alberta, which was actually a pretty good case and well watched, where a company went into bankruptcy called Redwater. The lender then sold all of the wells that had asset value. So everything of value the bank sold, and they left everything that needed to be P&A in with the state to be taken care of. And at that point, there were a number of cases that went all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court, and the Canadian court basically said, if you're a bank or lending institution or in first position on a loan, you can't just sell off all the good stuff and leave all the bad stuff for the state. You have to sell it all. You have to either everything goes or nothing goes. And that's really more or less the way it is in the United States. So this really had people up in arms in Canada for a while, but finally the Supreme Court came out and ruled that you can't just kind of leave the bad stuff for the state to take care of, which is the right thing. So we're going to dive in now to hopefully some less kind of arm waving and what the media does, and say, well, okay, is the problem really that bad? And what do we do to make sure that the problem isn't that bad? Okay. So first of all, the cost to abandon an onshore well. Well, it's kind of like saying, well, what's your car worth? Well, I don't know. How many miles are on it? Has it been wrecked? Is it new? Is it a truck? Is it a car? It's really, really hard to say. It depends on all these issues. But anecdotally, in California, there were 19 wells that cost about $22 million. So that's about $1.2 million a well for P&A. I think that's on the high side. But it's not certainly out of the realm of possibility. In Texas, we typically find P&A wells between $10,000 and $100,000 a well. So depending on depth, where it is, how complex the well is. And I would say that the average on that is actually on the lower side. Probably what I see is an average more in the $30,000 to $40,000 range. So it's certainly not as costly in Texas as as California wells purport to be. In Alberta, it's actually more expensive. The regulations are a little bit different. So you can kind of take the Texas numbers and almost multiply them by 2. And that's really has a lot more to do with the regulatory environment. There are a lot of more remote wells, and so the cost of doing business there is a little bit higher. My experience onshore U.S., if you look at the lower right-hand side, that's a really nice looking little, kind of well that's being P&A'd right there. General, nice sloping landscape, not a particularly deep well. That well, and the operator will remain nameless, ended up costing $75 million to P&A. And I know everybody's wondering how that could be and how could that possibly happen. It did happen, and I won't go into all the details about why. There was a commercial disposal well not far away that was disposing into a shallower zone, but it doesn't show on the picture, but there's a stream just beyond the rig you can see there. It goes into a lake, so there was a real concern about pollution if anything happened, and so on and so forth. So while it is, while P&A onshore is typically not cost a lot of money, it can cost a lot of money. And you have kind of a log normal distribution where a lot of the wells fall into the kind of the lower range. But you'll have some of these tail wells that actually do cost a lot of P&A. So that's something that has to be taken into account when you're looking at costs. So key levers to reducing abandonment liability. A big lever is number of wells. Can you put a campaign together with multiple wells? Can I group my own wells together and do them at the same time? Can I collaborate with another operator? Campaigns really lower the cost of because you get all the equipment that you need. Cementing, prod, wireline, rig. Those guys can just be booked for a month-long period. Go out, really saves a lot of money. You really save a lot with operational efficiency also when you're doing that. If you're only P&A'ing 1 or 2 wells a year, you're probably not going to be really good at it. But if you do a lot, you get really efficient, and that drives the cost down as well. Location, is it near industry infrastructure? Is it remote, like we talked about? Some in Alberta, day rate, clearly it costs more during boom cycles than bust cycles to P&A wells because all your cost of services are higher. Your day rate for your rig is higher, your cementing costs are higher. So this is kind of a good time if you have P&A wells, if you have any money, to be doing it. And I would say right now that's something that I would love to see the federal government or some of the state governments do, and that is fund some large P&A projects right now. It would put a lot of oil and gas folks back to work, doing work that has to be done anyway. So I guess if Governor Abbott were on this call, I would strongly suggest that he look at a plan to allocate money to P&A wells in the state of Texas to put folks back to work. Well depth, age, and type are certainly keys to this, the regulatory environment, and then salvage value. And I'm not going to talk much more about salvage value, but just remember the total P&A cost for a well is the cost to do the operations less anything you can sell from those operations. So whether it's tubing or some casing or tanks. Now I can tell you right now, tanks onshore cost more to get all the way than they're worth. So in different environments, the salvage value can be different. Right now, you don't get a whole lot for pump jacks or tanks or separators, but at different times in the cycle of the industry, you do. And of course, technology. And that's one thing that I continue to tell people on this call. Well, if you can find a technology that can reduce well P&As onshore or offshore, that's your ticket. So everybody ought to have their thinking caps on, trying to figure out how can I come up with a technology to help reduce costs of P&A wells. Okay. So now we're going to kind of switch over to something that's a little bit more kind of dry, I guess. Asset retirement obligation. What is it and why does it matter? And the definition of an asset retirement obligation is a legal obligation associated with retirement of a tangible long-lived asset required to settle an existing law, statute, or contract. In practice, ARO or decommissioning cost broadly refers to the amount of money that a company expects to incur in disposing of an asset. So, like I say, if you have a coal-fired power plant, for instance, you've got an asset retirement obligation. At some point, you're going to have to decommission that plant, and that cost has to be on your books as a liability on your balance sheet. Okay. So the process for calculating balance sheet ARO, and I'm not going to go into this. You'll have the slides if you want to look at it. But ARO is kind of an interesting calculation in that it is a future obligation that's reported as a present value, so it's discounted. So what you do is you determine the cost in today's dollars to decommission an asset. And for ARO calculations, you cannot assume technology improvement. So you have to look at it in today's dollars. How much would it cost me to P&A this well or to decommission this site today? And then you develop a schedule of dates upon which that decommissioning happens for each well, for each location, each tank battery. So if I think that I have reserves that are going to last for 10 years, in 10 years, I'm going to decommission the site and it's going to cost X. You project the inflation rate to determine the future costs. So like I say in the 10-year example, if it costs $100 today and you're going to discount that up at 2% a year, it's going to be more in the future. But then you get to discount it back to today's dollars using an effective discount rate, which is typically much higher than the inflation rate you use. So, if you have a bunch of retirement obligations 30 years in the future, you're not going to really be carrying much on your books on that because the discounted value of that cost 30 years from now is going to be very, very, very low. So for these long-lived projects, the balance sheet obligation or liability is typically pretty low because of the discount. Okay. And I know that's a lot to go over right now, but like I say, you've got the slides, and if you're interested in that, you can kind of dig into it, and there's plenty of things on the web or wherever you can get more information. So three keys to a good ARO process. Accuracy, first of all. Companies need to understand how much it's really going to cost to P&A wells, and that kind of, you think that kind of goes without saying, but let me tell you what, I've been at most companies where just really being able to determine how many wells we had was difficult. And I can tell you some companies right now, as crazy as it sounds, really probably don't know exactly how many wells they have in their portfolio because of legacy systems from multiple company databases and so on and so forth. So accuracy is a key to a good process. Streamline, having an internal process that has clear accountability, key to accuracy, and a key to a good process. Having a clear process and accountability speeds up the process and reduces not just the labor, but also the chance of making errors. And then a common platform. I think we all know that if you're doing kind of dealing with large amounts of data and you're doing it on spreadsheets that change every quarter, the chance for mistakes is, you almost can't do it without mistakes. So having an ARO management software that kind of pulls all the data into one place and is a common platform for everyone in your company to use is key. And I will say, in all fairness, that's one thing that Energy ARO provides. We do have a common software platform. It's in beta right now, so it's not quite ready for commercial use, but it is one thing that Energy ARO does provide. So let's talk a little bit about reserve reports. And the reason we talk about reserve reports is because really asset value is equal to the asset. It's equal to the value of the reserves minus the liability. Okay. So a good reserve report will give you an idea of an asset's value. It may or may not include P&A liability. And if it does include P&A liability, it will never match the ARO liability for a number of reasons. First of all, reserve reports are future cash flows discounted back to present at generally at a 10% discount rate. ARO uses a different discount rate, and it's typically a lower discount rate. So just as a little example, look at the difference of an estimated $10 million obligation 20 years from now in the future, discounted at 10%, that obligation would show up on your books as only $2.2 million. So we've got $10 million today it's going to cost, but on a reserve report, it would probably show up as $2 million because it's discounted at 10%. In the ARO process, that same liability would show up as almost $7 million because it's discounted back at a lower discount rate. So just something that you need to be aware of. And I'll say, I was involved in an asset sale, and this became a huge issue. The seller wanted to discount the buyer wanted to discount the obligation at 2%. We were discounting it at 10%, and it literally made millions and millions and millions of dollars difference in the deal, which ultimately didn't get done. So, reserve reports don't account for site reclamation and facility pipeline abandonment typically, and reserve reports don't account for wells with no reserve value. So, if you have inactive wells, they're not on your reserve report, and that liability doesn't show up on your reserve report if your reserve report includes P&A liability at all. So I know that's a lot to go over, but we're going to kind of tie it all together right here. Very simple, asset minus liabilities. So for reserves, you determine the future cash flow of your reserves, discounted back. The ARO liability is something that you find on the financial statements. And then buyer and seller need to kind of get together and figure out what kind of discount rate they're going to use to look at that liability. So I would say somewhere in the 5 to 8% range is right. I just gave you an example where the buyer wanted 2%, seller wanted 10%, never could agree on something in between. Okay? But the key fundamental here is the difference between the asset value and the ARO liability is kind of a way to get your valuation of oil and gas assets. So we talked about levers to reduce costs of P&A, and those are all on the left side. So all of those things that we talked about, how to reduce P&A costs, are still those things on the left-hand side, and they also will reduce the ARO liability. But there's some other things that the finance folks do that they can reduce liability costs. That is increase the discount rate, which you kind of got to get with your financial auditor to okay that. And decrease the inflation rate. So you say, you know what, I don't think the inflation rate over the next 30 years in oil and gas is going to be 3%. I think it's going to be 1%. So you make a case for that. That will lessen your asset retirement obligation liability. If you lengthen the reserve life, that will lessen that liability. Because remember, that liability is reduced over time due to discounting. The one thing that the ARO that you cannot do with the ARO calculations is reduce based on expected technology. With the P&As, technology, yes, put in. For the ARO, no, you cannot rely on future technology. And I would say that that is probably the, if there's one thing to kind of hear in these last 4 or 5 slides, technology is the key. The way that we're going to decrease these P&A costs that the industry has, or that states can decrease their obligation, is ultimately going to be through technology. And that's where we need to be looking. I just saw something actually this week that Norway had just funded a big center to enhance technology for decommissioning offshore. And that's what has to be done. Technology is where we need to get this. So all you folks out there, think about it. A couple of other points before I finish up, and I'm almost finished, so hang in there. Follow-on liability. Who has the responsibility to fix an incorrectly plugged well or an old unplugged well? And like I say, some of these orphan wells actually fall on the state at the end of the day. But a better answer is whoever is still around in the chain of title with deep enough pockets to fix it. So just because you sold it doesn't mean you get out of the liability. I remember probably 12 years ago or so, I was sitting in the office and we got a call about a casino in Louisiana that was, they said that there was leaking gas in the parking lot. Well, that well had ultimately been owned by the company that I was with, but it was like Pan American Oil back then. And then it had been sold multiple times as well as P&A, but we ended up having to fix the well. So we had to dig up the parking lot in the casino and excavate the well and fix it. So I think part of the issue or part of the answer is if there's somebody in the chain of title still around that has deep pockets, the state or the regulators will go after them to fix wells. Okay? But if there's no one left, then these orphan wells, then a well becomes orphan, and the government regulators have to take care of it. All of the bullets in the upper part there, we already talked about all those. We need some staggering numbers. The case that we talked about in Canada with Trident, where the directors all resigned and everybody was let go in the company, $329 million liability is not small. Overall in Alberta, there's probably about a $700 million liability for orphan wells. We talked about California, talked a little bit about Texas, the orphan wells in Texas. The orphan well count in Texas is relatively small at 6 to 300 and 200 million. But I would say that there are probably at least really, there are probably really at least twice that many wells. This is kind of the reported number, and a lot of these wells are not categorized as abandoned because the Railroad Commission and the state are hopeful that they can find someone to take them on. But as we know, hope's not a great strategy. And then, of course, in California, there are 8,500 ID orphan wells. They claim about 200,000 non-ID wells. So if you've got a technology that you can go out and find all these wells that haven't been identified, that would be a great thing as well. So kind of want to finish up by saying, you know, this is a problem for the industry, but it's a problem that we can figure out. We've got folks that know how to do this. We've got great minds, great technology, and this is something that we can figure out. And like I say, if you have an idea or technology that can help reduce this orphan well issue or this inactive well issue, well, I would really strongly suggest to see about what you can do to bring you to market. So what does the future hold? Well, I think the offshore space has done a pretty good job of understanding the liabilities, working to improve P&A costs, utilizing technology, reducing costs. Like I say, Norway just started and funded a new center for offshore abandonment technologies. And the federal government's probably done a better job than the states of ensuring that bonds are in place and that there's money around when these when these wells have to be P&A. Onshore, I think most operators are in an okay place, but there's work to do. You know, there are these folks like this AR Resources in Pennsylvania that kind of ended up walking away. They were funded by a PE firm and ended up walking away, and that is not that's not a good thing. I say most operators are not in that place, but there are some that are, and with a prolonged downturn, there'll probably be more. So anything you can do, from finding unknown well bores to figuring out less expensive ways to abandon wells, would be a very, very good thing, and you can make a lot of money doing it. I can guarantee you that. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. I want to thank you. You can visit the Energy Arrow website if you'd like to learn more about us. And now it's time. Let's have a discussion. This is I'm tired of talking. You probably have heard me talk too long anyway. So let's have a discussion.
All right, Wayne, we do have a few questions here. I guess I'll start back. I don't know, some of these may have been answered, but we'll just go back to Henry Dar, who wants to know why P&A cost is a secret, and can you please go through some of the factors that affect the cost?
Okay, so I'm sorry, why is it a secret, and what was the other one?
And what are some of the factors that affect the cost?
Okay, so I think the reason it's a secret is, first of all, the reporting, the financial reporting, is a little bit opaque. It is not as probably as clear cut as it should be. That's not an oil company's problem. I mean, that's probably in every industry. There are the rules that oil companies follow, and those are set out by the SEC, by GAAP, by IFRS if you're outside of U.S. reporting. So the rules are probably not great rules, and as good as they could be. And then, particularly for large companies, you know, the process of getting your abandonment retirement obligation calculated and on the books usually goes through a lot of different hands in the process. You know, it can go everywhere. It can start with some of the guys in the field and go all the way through operations and then engineering and finance. So, you know, some of it is the processes are just not that great, and it's kind of complicated. I mean, it's not as simple a process as you might think, particularly if you've got tens of thousands of wells. So, and then I think, you know, we kind of hit pretty well on some slides talking about how to reduce costs. I mean, you go back and you had 2 slides on that, and you know, you can kind of go back and kind of go through the checklist on that. But it's not as simple a process as you might think. And the problem is that everybody kind of holds a little piece of it. So the engineer that's responsible for an asset that says, well, this well is going to cost X amount to P&A. Well, that might be great, but by the time it gets 5 or 6 layers up in an organization and somebody in finance is trying to transcribe that into some other spreadsheet or whatever, that number sometimes doesn't look the same as it did when it first started out.
Okay, our next question here is from Russell Robbins. In general, is there a lifespan for the P&A application, or will older offshore P&As have to be redone in the future due to failure or changes in regulation?
Wow,
so what is the average lifespan?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think that I could go into some complex answers around some work that was done with CO2 sequestration, but I won't do that right now. I can only tell you that I think the best we know right now, these P&As are, they should be good for kind of all time. But I think that probably 100 years ago, folks thought what they were doing to P&A was probably pretty adequate at that point, and it wasn't. So really tough question, really good question, and I don't think anybody probably really knows the answer. I think most people would assume that the P&As that we do are, are going to be good for kind of, an infinite amount of time, but nothing seems to ever work infinitely. So, tough question. There's probably some other folks on the call that could address that better than I, but yeah, that's a tough question. All I can say is we think what we're doing now, given the best technology and the best we know right now, is good. But that could change.
Okay, our next question here is from Miguel Hilales. During the P&A, during the P&G of a well, is the field or other active wells are shut in, or what activity is suspended to prevent any accident?
So if you have a single well on a pad, usually nothing else in the field is shut in. If you have multiple wells on a pad, then you may have some other wells next to it shut in, just because of your SIMOPS policy that you're working through. But I would say there's not really a requirement most of the time for any other wells to be shut in or facilities to be shut in. Because you think about this well that you're P&Aing is isolated at the surface, and now you're isolating it down hole. So in general, nothing else is shut in unless your SIMOPS policy calls for it, where you have multiple wells on the same pad. And then what might drive it is the fact that you have some overhead lifts or something like that you're worried about other wellheads. So no, I'd say that's why your SIMOPS policy will generally end up being the thing that dictates whether anything else is shut in or not.
Okay, the next question is from just initials PMT, and it's 75 million. What went wrong? Can you briefly summarize?
There is no way to briefly summarize what went wrong on that. I think there was a lot of regulatory scrutiny. There was a lot of scrutiny from the company, literally from the CEO on down, and then it was a very, very, very tough problem with underground cross flow and very shallow cross flow. We have these kind of pressures that get brought up from deep work to a very shallow zone. It is difficult. The snubbing unit on that well for months and months and months. And there were a lot of things that, really nothing really went wrong in the P&A, quite frankly. What drove the cost was a very, very complex problem that had a lot of eyes on it, and risk tolerance at the time was zero. So that's kind of what drove that cost.
Okay, our next question is from Salim Hanna. Why is the onshore range so big? Why is California cost of P&A so high?
You know, that's a good question. I don't really know why. I can surmise that it has to do kind of with why Colorado P&As right now are getting very, very high and difficult, and some of the costs it drives in Alberta as well. And in those cases, it's not really P&Aing the well that drives the cost. It's the remediation of the site that drives the cost. You're seeing that in Colorado right now. I mean, just some tremendous costs in how sites have to be remediated, how gathering lines have to be evacuated, and in some cases removed. You know, I can only imagine in California that you're probably having to take out 4 or 5 feet of soil and then take it to a Superfund disposal site and bring in all new soil. So I don't know that for a fact. It's just speculation. But my guess is what's driving those costs is site reclamation and not well.
Wayne, as a follow-up to that, is it not just plug and abandonment? You already have referred it to either reclamation and the site remediations are a part of the whole exercise. So it's not just plug and abandonment, it's just a asset retirement obligation, which probably is not just a plug and abandonment, it is also site remediations, reclamations, all of those. Yeah. That is why probably California is very careful about the environmental obligations and all that. That is the reason probably California is high. Then with respect to the Alberta, I used to live in Canada before, 15 years ago, and ERCB, which is now called Alberta Energy Regulator. They changed their name quite a few times. I think this is the third time they changed it. And they, about 20 years ago, when they're approving a drilling license, they would withhold about $30,000 probably to ensure the company eventually abandons the wells. And if they don't, then they use that money, government, to abandon the wells. Because it was a fact that a lot of people who left Canada came to USA. I know one guy, I'm not going to give the name to you. He came to Texas and then went to California. He left behind a lot of the wells and didn't leave any money because at that time there was no regulations because he was not probably drilling the wells. Those were sold over to him. And then he in turn left them and came over to USA. So it became an obligation for Alberta government. So Alberta government sat down with many of the companies, major companies, and decided how they're going to tackle these issues. That's what they introduced, the $30,000 withholding amount of money put into escrow account, interest bearing. But if you don't do your obligation, then they will use that money. Otherwise, if you do it, your job properly, then they'll return the money.
Yeah, and
other question to you is that what is the proper plug and abandonment that you mentioned? If it is properly plugged and abandoned, then there should not be any methane leakage.
Correct. And there's there are sensors that can determine that. That's that's kind of a relatively easy determination. But yeah, exactly. I mean, that is one way to make sure that you can kind of tell for sure that it's done properly, is to make sure this methane sensor not to make sure there's no methane. I will add on to the Alberta situation. What they did with regard to some of the court cases is the regulator has a ratio called LMR, or liability management ratio. Basically, your assets have to be worth twice what your abandonment liability is. And if it's not, they will not let you transact up there. So in other words, if somebody comes and wants to buy your oil and gas wells and either you or they don't have a ratio greater than 2, they will not let you, they will not transfer the license on that. So they've kind of taken a different tack than some other operators, some other regulatory agencies have. And basically they've said, you know, we don't care what the Supreme Court or what the provisional courts say. We're not going to let you transact unless you have this asset to liability ratio greater than 2, which is kind of an interesting way to go about it. And it's causing some problems, but we won't go into that whole issue right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Alex?
Sorry, I was muted there. Our next question is from Sue Firth. How do these costs stack up again against sealing the Deepwater Horizon disaster well?
Oh my gosh! Well, I mean that's I think you go from the largest P&A I've heard of onshore, which there's probably one that's bigger, 75 million, and that's kind of $75 billion. So I mean these don't even compare. I think that's a deep water P&A problem is dwarfs anything you would see onshore.
Okay, our next question again is from Miguel Ilales. What is left in the well hole when the well is P&A?
Typically just casing. That's all that's left, and a lot of times the casing is cut. Sometimes at 1,000 feet below surface, it's always cut off. Usually 5 or 10 feet below surface, but all you're left with is casing, and then there is no casing, like say from surface to some depth below that, depending on where you can actually retrieve the casing. So that's all that's left. Is casing and cement down in the well somewhere.
And if I may add to that question, obviously we have cemented in that section of casing that remains below. For onshore wells, how many feet of cement do we put in there besides cementing plugs, bridge plugs, and so on?
Well, there are typically multiple cement plugs in a well, and depending on the jurisdiction, it can be different. But 100 feet would be 100-foot plug would probably be a good estimate for an average. But let's say it can vary. But 100 feet generally is about what the cement plug height minimum is required to be.
Yeah, in offshore operations, yeah, that is 500 feet. Thanks, Wayne.
Our next question here is from Hermano Vaca. Are the regulations for P&A rigidly enforced? An example in Texas, Louisiana. And if so, what are the time limits and penalties?
So I'm going to break that question up into 2 quick answers, if you don't mind. And first, I'm going to throw Louisiana aside because I'm not familiar with Louisiana. In Texas, there are 2 things that are enforced in the P&A. One is the timing of the P&A and the timing of the removal of equipment from the site. And then the last is when the well is actually really P&A and you're putting cement plugs in it. The timing is pretty strictly enforced. It really is. I mean, there are operators that certainly can kind of skirt the rules a little bit, but by and large, those rules are enforced pretty rigidly. And I can tell you right now, in the slowdown in the oil and gas business, the regulators don't have anything else to do, and they are really, really enforcing that very hard. And there's 3 different tank batteries that I had to have removed last month because they're getting really, really strict on and not giving you any leeway at all. So I think by and large, the timing is enforced pretty well. And usually there has to be an inspector out on location when you can a well signed off on it. So I would say by and large, both timing and operations are pretty rigidly enforced in most states that I know of, but I can't speak to Louisiana because I don't know what they do enforcement wise. But I can tell you that, you know, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, North Dakota, California, all of those are pretty rigidly enforced. And I would say that Texas is probably even the least rigidly enforced of all of those. And Texas is pretty rigidly enforced.
Yeah, we've got a question here from Salim Hanna. Why would you choose a discount rate much higher than the inflation rate?
That really has to do with GAAP and IFRS accounting rules, and they allow you to use a risk-free discount rate in those rules. So, I mean, without going into detail on that, because you could probably get like some accounting guru that could talk for hours on it. It's basically a rate that is relatively mandated by accounting practices. You have a little bit of leeway in what you can do, but they kind of will let you. So, I mean, some people kind of use a risk-free rate. Some people use a risk rate for that, but it falls into a generally pretty narrow band.
Okay, and I think a follow-up to that, or an add-on to that, is does the Texas Railroad Commission, in granting a drilling license, withhold a reasonable amount to fulfill the liability of abandonment in the case of the operator does not carry out the abandonment?
So the state does put money into a fund for various permits, and then every operator has to have a plugging bond or a plugging deposit on file. So right now, for example, if you have it's between 10 and 100 wells, you have to have a $50,000 cash bond on deposit with the Railroad Commission. So there are bonds that the Railroad Commission holds, or they're actually deposits, because most of these are cash bonds. And then they also put money into a plugging fund from some of the other permits, drilling permits, and the other things that are done. So yeah, so the state of Texas does put money away to handle this issue. And I would say right now that is something that they should do. You know, I look at it's easier to pick on Pennsylvania because they're not right here. But let me tell you, the state of Pennsylvania has taken untold amount of money out of the oil and gas business from royalties and from taxes. And so, you know, the fact that maybe they didn't put enough money aside for a rainy day, you know, I would say shame on them, because, you know, you can't manage a business like that, like only taking, and you know you're going to have some costs associated with that as well. So maybe not a real popular view, but what the state of Texas is doing and what Alberta does and what the other states do is absolutely the right thing to do. You know, they take part of those funds that they get and set them aside for, you know, one thing we didn't talk about on this is what happens as we go to a lower carbon or a low carbon environment. You know, I hear a lot of people talking about the fact that we're going to all be doing everything with windmills and solar panels. That's great, but you know, you do that, you're also going to have a lot of wells that are going to have to be properly decommissioned, and that needs to be accounted for.
Okay. Next question here is from Henry Dar. why do wells, I guess, why do wells stay so long abandoned without P&A? How does the state accept that?
Well, I think most operators, if it's not an orphan well, I think operators are they have to get those wells abandoned. I mean, once they become inactive, there's a time frame by which they ultimately have to be decommissioned. The issue is more with the state, and why isn't the state going faster with their inventory of orphan wells? And the state of Texas, every now and then, they have basically an online auction, if you will. They'll say, hey, you know what? We're putting these 50 wells out for bid, and we need, we're taking bids for people to P&A these. They have to be P&A'd in the next 6 months. So the states do kind of stay on a schedule to a degree, but I would say it's more the states and the provinces dragging their feet than the oil companies, because the oil companies are required to stay on a timeline and get these things taken care of, and by and large they do.
Alex, one more question, if you don't mind, and then we'll get everybody to open their video and we'll take a picture. In the meantime, Wayne, be looking for one to reshare again to a slide that you would like the picture to be in. But yeah, one more question, if you don't mind.
Okay, this is from Edgar Anderson. Does the state of Texas have something like like a site-specific trust fund in Louisiana where the buyer can set up a fund and the seller is relieved of future responsibility?
Not that I'm aware of, Edgar. So that's a good question, but not that I'm aware of. I know what you're talking about, but you can. What the state of Texas will let you do is, if there are wells that you're not going to take that you are going to plug, they will let you put basically a 100% bond up on those wells. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, well, why would you not just plug them anyway yourself? So I think the answer to that is not exactly like Louisiana.
Well, to add to that, what Wayne said, my personal experience is that in 1998, when the oil price slumped to $9 a barrel, I had the opportunity of buying 9 wells. So the agreement we had with the seller is that, these wells had a percentage from about 5% to 18%. That from the production that we receive, for the oil and gas production, a certain percentage of that is set aside for future abandonment. So that's how we built that abandonment cost. In case we are the one who are the last one to, when oil and gas has been depleted, to abandon the oil, then that fund will be utilized for that purpose. But if you sell it off to the next person, then it is a different case. Then we have to make the same kind of arrangement as we have done with the previous seller who sold it to us.
And Salim, I would say that's really a best practice right there. I mean, that's something that most people don't do. I think it's a really, really great practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say also that there's a misconception that this ARO liability that's on people's books, that it's a big like account full of money somewhere, but it's not. It's a book entry. It's not kind of a money that you can go and pull out of a bank account. So what you guys did was really smart, and that's a really good way to, that's kind of how we would handle our personal finances, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
that's right. Yeah.
You put money aside because your air conditioner's going to break one day. But that doesn't happen very often. I haven't seen that happen. So good practice.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are many other good questions, actually. If you would open your chat, Wayne, you would also read some. But in the meantime, as Wayne works to share one slide that he would like in the picture, all of you who would like to open the video, please do so at this moment, and we will take a picture with all of you. So whether your hair is good or not, will be in the picture. So yeah. So yep. Julia, Paul Curry, Scott, Rocky, Emily Britton, Henry, Miguel, Mudit. Yeah, open your video if you don't mind.
I'm sorry. What did you say, Carlos?
Yeah, just share your presentation again. What one slide that you want?
Okay, just a second. Let's see. Trying to find one that I want here. How about that one?
Yeah, display settings.
Hold on.
No, left. Literally left. In your in the black. No, wait to the left. To your left. Top left. Top left. There you go. Below. No. Show. Okay. The next one. The next one. There you go. Swap presenter. There you go. Okay. So Miguel, Paul, Rocky, Scott, Herman, Henry, and Lee, if you'd like, I'll give you a few seconds to turn on your video. Okay, here we go. All right. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome to unshare, Wayne. I know that Tarek is also taking some pictures. So yeah, if you, you're more than welcome to introduce the next presenter, Alex. I'll stop recording right now.